I feel good enough to keep telling the story about the Tsenacommacah tribe, confederation, empire that reached all the way from Delaware. The Delaware kind of like had a relationship. Some of the tribes of the Delaware Native Americans were kind of also friendly or part of the Tsenacommacah Confederation. So I just kind of want to let people know that. And then also all the way down to the Carolinas, then all the way out to the Shenandoah and the Appalachian Mountains was the reach of the Tsenacommacah natives. So I'm going to get back into painting, and at the same time while I'm painting, I'm going to basically be telling, basically teaching about real life American history, the history before there was a country, the history before the natives. And the most important native was Tsenacommacah. He was the most important, Tsenacommacah. He was the most important native that we want to know. Also, Powhatan Confederacy was very important as well, but it's just very important to have to know about these two guys because they basically performed a very they intimidated the colonies. Even though the British had superior technologies, these guys were a force to be reckoned with, and they were not defeated in battle. They were defeated by trickery. So most of the recount that we have of the Native Americans is from John Smith's records and a few of the mercenaries that came here. In terms of English information. But even by that information, we can confirm the Native American record as well. And even the picture, if you was to go look on, say, the internet for a picture of Tsenacommacah, you will wind up finding a picture of another native. The natives were basically tall, slim guys. They're not necessarily slim, they had very muscular bodies, but they were very known to be tall. They were tall people. So, especially the Wessawarrants or the Tsenacommacah. And basically, anytime you see Wessa or Wessawarrants, that basically is the leaders, the family of the leaders. Basically meant the person who is the commander, the dominant person. And the women also were called that as well. So there was a region that these people were from. And that was the Tidewater area of Virginia. So I'm going to attempt again, just like I did yesterday, to paint and at the same time tell the history. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to focus painting on Tsenacommacah and also the rest of the painting. But I'm going to focus on him today because I really want to get him going. And Chief Powhatan Confederacy, which is also called Chief Powhatan incorrectly, he basically inherited his country, but he had basically 7 tribes underneath his control that he inherited. And he expanded those tribes to include 31 additional tribes into his confederation that was called the Tsenacommacah. So I just want to get that straight. I don't know if I actually created that correctly yesterday. And basically, he was located in the southeastern portion of Virginia near where we call Jamestown, right at the York River, at the fork of the York and the Pamunkey River. That's basically his #1 headquarters that he had before the English came. And most of these guys, even Tsenacommacah, he was also a half-brother or nephew or some relationship to Powhatan Confederacy. So most of the people that became the Wessawarrants, and that's how they kind of established things. What happened was he made friends with whoever the Wessawarrants was of that tribe. And then they would give him a daughter. They would give Powhatan Confederacy a daughter. That daughter would have a child, and those tribes would then be joined. That was how they set up the crescent. It was peaceful, the way the natives actually would connect with each other. And of course, in their traditions, the women actually had a lot of power, had a lot of say. And so therefore, it made a lot of sense that if your daughter married, and that's for that reason, it's because that's how you built up your nation. That's how you built up your people. So that's how the women started getting very, very dominant, because a dominant male would simply say, okay, this is another dominant male, and I like to be joined with him. He's more powerful than me, but I think there's more safety if we join with him. So from that point on, my lineage is going to be joined with his. And of course, I'm an older Wesselwarings, and he's a younger Wesselwarings. And that's kind of how they did it, you know. Now, what happened was, when in 1707, Powhatan Confederacy was already an older man, but he still had a powerful build on him. He still was very, very capable of moving around his kingdom and finding out what's going on, or who are these new people that's in my region. So he had a lot of that. He was not like a 90-year-old man of today. He was still a very, very vibrant, strong man. Even at 90-something years old, when the colonials, when the Anglos, the English, showed up. Now, Wesselwarings Opanchanakanno, basically, he was really the real king. This guy was Powhatan Confederacy, which is Matoaka's father, was older. So he just got his young guy. He had already selected this guy to be the next guy. He had already known this guy's father and mother. They were smart people. But there was also another guy that they had selected, was just as capable of him to be Matoaka's husband. He was the second choice. But when the English came, they killed him. So one of the first things they found out was that in order for us to survive, you know, this is a hard way to go. We're starving. All these things is happening. The only way we can actually survive and get food is we have to be friends with Powhatan Confederacy. These people have to bring us food. They have to keep us supplied. And so they had to always give ingots and trinkets, you know, compasses, watches, pieces of jewelry, mirrors, things that the Native Americans had never seen before. They was constantly giving them things. And these things that they gave them was looked at as a sign of wanting to be friendly with them. But in reality, what happened was it was just buying time. And ultimately, in the end, when this guy was in his 90s, of course, when he showed up, he was in his teens. When the colonists showed up, when he was in his 90s, I said yesterday he was actually shot point blank in the chest. They actually shot him in the back. And he wasn't even young when they shot him in the back. They was still very, very young. Very old. He was a 90-some-year-old person. And they shot him in the back. And it was a guard that shot him in the back. Because they just didn't like him. There was just no respect. And this was only after parading him around in front of his people as a spectacle. So that's why they want you to know that the name is Powhatan. They want you to know the name is Powhatan because they don't want you to know the real names of Powhatan Confederacy and Opanchanakanno. They don't want you to know these names because these guys held Virginia down. Even with the diseases that was killing their people. At the same time while they was battling with the natives, with the colonists, they was racked with European diseases that they had never experienced before. So, with that said, there is a lot of, they had to do a lot of things to keep themselves, to keep their nation going. And they did pretty good for what they knew against the British Empire. They did a very good job. And from the very beginning, the only thing that really the colonists wanted was their land, their territory. And any claims that you find that certain people are making that they were Powhatan Tsenacommacah's descendant, first of all, they don't go by the male lineage; they go by the female. And then those are false claims. I would challenge anybody to do a DNA test and see if not your lineage goes directly to Europe and does not stay here on this continent. So a lot of these people, before DNA, they could claim anything, only to find out that, they were telling lies. But Powhatan Confederacy was portrayed as a very large person by Captain John Smith, tall. There are two versions of his name. The English use Opakchano, but the Native Americans actually called him Opakchana Kano. So if you hear his name mentioned two different ways, that's why. There have been movies made with Powhatan Confederacy by other Europeans other than the English and Americans, that kind of have a slightly different pronunciation of his name. And he was in a Sky TV show, Jamestown, as well, defending his people. Now, he was definitely preceded by Chief Powhatan, and he wasn't preceded by Chief Powhatan, or I should call him Chief Wessel Warrens Powhatan, not because he was selected the traditional way, because a lot of the other guys that was in position that just simply got killed off by, guess who? The English. There was just nobody else left that was tough enough. And he basically was elected simply because he was so tough, he could not be killed. He could not be destroyed. He was not somebody who was going to go down really easy. And he proved to be very, very resilient to domination by the English. He proved to be very, very resilient to that. To the English's surprise, actually, that somebody they consider to be a savage, with not a whole lot of what they consider education, was so cunning and was so smart as to not allow himself to get captured or defeated by them, even though they had all the so-called superior military capabilities and knowledge. And the Tsenacommacah Wars is the largest, by the way, is the longest going war in the history of America. And they don't even tell you about that. It's the longest ongoing war in the history of America, and it was buried. It was buried because there's no legitimate claim for this country to exist if it wasn't buried. It would have to include the Tsenacommacah, because the way it was taken was in a despicable way. The Pocahontas story is just made to legitimize the English right to just take land for themselves. That's all it was for. That's all Pocahontas was invented for. All of the honor and all of the stuff they try to give Pocahontas, she wasn't fighting for that. She didn't know anything about those things. That's not what her thoughts are. Her thoughts were simply to stay alive. And her real job was just to have future daughters, to make future Wessa Warrants a king bloodline. That's basically what her real calling in life was to do. That's really all she had to do was make daughters, and that her daughter, the best daughter was going to be the new Matoaka, the new Anuet, the new Wessa Warrants. And what I'm doing is I really want to focus on the musculature of Opec Chicano, simply because Captain John Smith really went into details about the description of this guy. So they were definitely intimidated by Opec Chicano. And everything that I'm actually telling can be is referenced by not just me, but many other sources in different places. And if you was to read all those sources, you would see that the best recollection of what actually happened is the Native American version. It's the only story that just doesn't have much scrutiny, and it makes the most sense, because that's the true story. And just because the local natives might have a certain story, that doesn't mean that the people, the royal people, there was more than just one family, there was many, many families. They left the region, some of them. Some of them stayed, some of them left. They took the stories with them. And what I'm going to do is, it's hard to actually teach history and paint at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint. And then every once in a while, I'm going to just kind of throw out something as it comes to me. And the reason they call Powhatan Powhatan, because one of the most holy places, the divine places where he lived, where one of his main headquarters were, where the natives, when they went to scout the land, the natives said, he's near Powhatan. It's kind of like the same as saying divine one or your majesty. Where does, because they didn't really, he had a bunch of names. His name was not just Tsenacommacah. He had many titles. Let's just say titles. Because they were considered to be divine people. Again, they were considered to be the rightful leaders and heirs of this land, this area. And their names are ancient families of this region. And actually, yesterday I said the James River, King James. That's what the James River that goes through Richmond was named. But before that, it was, guess what it was called? Powhatan. Powhatan. Basically, means the river, the holy river, where the river of Mishe Manuto goes. basically that's what it was called. So when you got from and that went all the way from the mouth of the Chesapeake all the way through Richmond. And what they did was, instead of giving it, they thought it was the name of Powhatan. That's why they named it Powhatan, Chief Powhatan. But basically it meant only way to the holy place. It's basically what it meant. It was Powhatan, only way to the holy place. That's basically what it meant. And they said, oh, they're naming this after their king, Powhatan. So you know what? We're going to rename it by our king, King James at the time. So they actually rename the the Powhatan River to Powhatan. Not to Powhatan, to James River. So everything they were doing was trying to disown or disenfranchise the native people out of their land. Nothing was done to preserve any memory of the original monarchs of this land and the original owners of this land. So it was definitely, and that's why I say the whole story of Pocahontas as a princess and Marion John Roth, who was one of the owners of the colony, was to set him up. He was one of the only owners to actually come here. The rest of them just lived in England. And he really wanted to be the king of this area. He wanted to be the first family. He wanted to be the Englishman. Again, against, of course, they had their women's system here. But he wanted to be the English man who basically inherited the new land by blood. And that blood was by Matoaka, because they saw how much respect Matoaka and not Powhatan, but Tsenacommacah, and then even Opac Chicano, the people of the Wasawarks, or Wesamoka, got a lot of respect. And the reality is, the English thought a lot of people was Tsenacommacah or Powhatan. They was constantly calling different people Powhatan who wasn't Powhatan. They might have been a nobleman. They might have been a royal person. And what happened was the Native Americans, to distinguish between the normal run-of-the-day Native American and the aristocracy of the Native Americans, they would wear pearls from the Chesapeake Bay and shells that would shine really, really bright, cut into beads and shine really, really bright. And most of the time, if you saw a native wearing shell beads and pearls, that meant that was a very important person. And oftentimes the Wesawarks, a paramount leader of a certain tribe or certain, let's just not call them tribes. We're going to call them families. Very, very large families. In Scotland, for example, they would call these clans. You know, like the McCoy clan or the whatever clan. Basically, something very similar to this. And what you had was you just had a marriage between clans, and it built into a whole nation. Now, they give some smaller populations, because they don't want to give any big numbers to the population of the Tsenacommacah. That was about 50,000 people. But it was closer to 1 million people. Anywhere between, I'm gonna just underestimate it to anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million people. And the density of that population of people was mostly at the fork of the York River, the Pamunkey River, and the Mattaponi River. That's where the population got more dense. However, they were all over. Especially in what the area we call Richmond, Virginia. They were very dense there. They were very dense in the area we call Henrico. They were very dense in these areas. And even the archaeologists, the current archaeologists have found buildings, settlements from the Wesawarinks that have been carbon dated with artifacts that they built as early as the 1100, 1200s, the 11th and 12th centuries. So, and that's after a very, very dominant society had already risen. That's not the society as it was coming up. It was the society as they had already established quite a bit of power and quite a bit of influence in the area. And who knows where they probably lived before then. So, but being known as the Tsenacommacah, being known as the Tsenacommacah, they have been known by those names at least since those times because of the totems and the various iconography that the people made was consistent. Even though they didn't have a language, they still had a lot of visual symbolism connected with their identity that they actually made. So the Powhatan tribe was destroyed by the English in one war. They just went into one region near the Upper James River, which is currently the Upper James River, near where the 95 and 64 meet. If you ever go through there, it was that tribe existed, and they just went in there and basically just destroyed all those people out of that area. After basically some misunderstandings, the natives just didn't understand ownership. And so what happened is every time they did something against what the colonials thought was right, the colonials would just go in and just wipe them out. They're go into a village and just basically wipe them out. And see, what a lot of times people don't understand about the original Tsenacommacahs is that the women were the ones that was in the villages, not the men. It was the women. So it was very easy to go into a village and destroy everybody because the men were going to be hunting and doing some activity or fishing or doing some activity like that. They weren't going to necessarily just be hanging around. That was all the agricultural work was done by the women. It was considered women's work to do the agriculture. Women basically built all of the ornamentalia, all of the clothing, things like that. What the men basically did was hunt. So it was very easy to go into a Native American village and just wipe everybody out. Because oftentimes the men were not there. And then in the daytime, the men would in the evenings, the men would come in from their hunts or wherever they were. And then there would be food, there would be whatever it is that the women had prepared for them. And that's kind of how things were. So the colonials was finding this out. They were finding out how this is working. So what they would do is they would just wait. They would just wait. And then when the men weren't there, they would just come in and just wipe everybody out. And so you had a bunch of guys going around that was mad because their wives and kids were all slaughtered. And the wars basically started from the very beginning, 1607. And what most things that happened was based on some type of reconciliation. And usually what the colonials found out is we give them something that they don't have, like a clock, or we give them some little piece of ingot. The people of the Wesawarinks, or Tsenacommacah, got a lot of respect. And the reality is, the English thought a lot of people was Powhatan or Powhatan. They was constantly calling different people Powhatan who wasn't Powhatan. They might have been a nobleman. They might have been a royal person. And what happened was the Native Americans, to distinguish between the normal run-of-the-day Native American and the aristocracy of the Native Americans, they would wear pearls from the Chesapeake Bay and shells that would shine really, really bright, cut into beads and shine really, really bright. And most of the time, if you saw a native wearing shell beads and pearls, that meant that was a very important person. And oftentimes the Wesawants, a paramount leader of a certain tribe or certain, let's just not call them tribes. We're going to call them families. Very, very large families. In Scotland, for example, they would call these clans. You know, like the McCoy clan or the whatever clan. Basically, something very similar to this. And what you had was you just had a marriage between clans, and it built into a whole nation. Now, they give some smaller populations, so they don't want to give any big numbers to the population of the Tsenacommacah. That was about 50,000 people. But it was closer to 1 million people. Anywhere between, I'm gonna just underestimate it to anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million people. And the density of that population of people was mostly at the fork of the York River, the Pamunkey River, and the Mattaponi River. That's where the population got more dense. However, they were all over. They were all over, especially in what the area we call Richmond, Virginia. They were very dense there. They were very dense in the area we call Henrico. They were very dense in these areas. And even the archaeologists, the current archaeologists have found buildings, settlements from the Wesawants that have been carbon dated with artifacts that they built as early as the 1100, 1200s, the 11th and 12th centuries. So, and that's after a very, very dominant society had already risen. That's not the society as it was coming up. It was the society as they had already established quite a bit of power and quite a bit of influence in the area. And who knows where they probably lived before then. So, but being known as the Tsenacommacah, being known as the Tsenacommacah, they have been known by those names at least since those times because of the totems and the various iconography that the people made was consistent. Even though they didn't have a language, they still had a lot of visual symbolism connected with their identity that they actually made. So the Powhatan tribe was destroyed by the English in one war. They just went into one region near the Upper James River, which is currently the Upper James River, near where the 95 and 64 meet. If you ever go through there, that tribe existed, and they just went in there and basically just destroyed all those people out of that area. After basically some misunderstandings, the natives just didn't understand ownership. And so what happened is every time they did something against what the colonials thought was right, the colonials would just go in and just wipe them out. They're go into a village and just basically wipe them out. And see, what a lot of times people don't understand about the original Tsenacommacahs is that the women were the ones that was in the villages, not the men. It was the women. So it was very easy to go into a village and destroy everybody because the men were going to be hunting and doing some activity, or fishing, or doing some activity like that. They weren't going to necessarily just be hanging around. That was all of the agricultural work was done by the women. It was considered women's work to do the agriculture. Women basically built all of the ornamentalia, all of the clothing, things like that. What the men basically did was hunt. So it was very easy to go into a Native American village and just wipe everybody out. Because oftentimes the men were not there. And then in the daytime, the men would in the evenings, the men would come in from their hunts or wherever they were. And then there would be food, there would be whatever it is that the women had prepared for them. And that's kind of how things were. So the colonials was finding this out. They were finding out how this was working. So what they would do is they would just wait. They would just wait. And then when the men weren't there, they would just come in and just wipe everybody out. And so you had a bunch of guys going around that was mad because their wives and kids were all slaughtered. And the wars basically started from the very beginning, 1607. And what most things that happened was based on some type of reconciliation. And usually what the colonials found out is we give them something that they don't have, like a clock, or we give them some little piece of ingot. They might just let us go for this grievance that we've done against them. They might just spare us. And it kind of worked to a certain degree, because what the natives thought they were going to do is come back later. Something else is going to happen. We're going to come back later and get them anyway. So this was working for a long time. And this proved to be a policy that the natives had that was full of flaws, and also caused their demise, because that allowed the colonials to really build up, and get to be a big population of people here. And so on. So but I don't think I have a lot of people here today, so you know what I'm gonna do? I just want to paint. Just gonna focus on painting right now. So I told a lot of the story yesterday, and I don't want to bore people too much. Even John Smith called Powhatan Tsenacommacah the emperor. He said they're emperor. So there was a lot of people here. There was a dense population in Virginia up to Tsenacommacah. course, white beads was a symbol, especially if the women wore them, of their rank and how important they were. And that jewelry was very, very nice, very, very impressive. Even the English thought that some of the jewelry they were making out of pearls and shells and beading was some of the very, very fine jewelry. And they were surprised that the Native Americans could make such fine jewelry, but at the same time, basically walk around buck naked. They didn't understand how that could be. But again, wearing the beads was an example, or was a basically letting people know that you were somebody very important amongst the Tsenacommacah. And that was both the men and the women who would wear these pearl beads and the shell beads and pearls. Again, they were fishermen. They're a maritime people. They did a lot with the water. They were water people. They were also woodland people, but more importantly, and just as importantly, they were maritime people who did a lot with fishing. By the way, Powhatan Tsenacommacah's burial place is still on the Pamunkey Reservation. That's where he's buried, right there. So that's probably his original place of origin. He kept moving his place of origin to get away from the murderous English. He kept moving because, they were dangerous. And he didn't want him as a king to be captured by them. That would not go good for him. It wouldn't look good for him with his people, to see the English so close to him, and all that stuff about them getting close to Powhatan Tsenacommacah. I don't believe that's true. It's not true because they had the men, like Powhatan Tsenacommacah and Opachicano, had an extreme amount of pride. And they were definitely not going to sit down at a powwow and chit-chat with somebody they knew was invading them. That won't happen. I think there were some proxy people or some people of high rank that the English thought was Powhatan Tsenacommacah was the premier leader, or what they call the Powhatan town, or the Powhatan chief, or the Powhatan leader. But the truth is that they never knew who it was they was meeting. Often the king had a lot of brothers who were Wesseroxes of their own personal tribes. And, just like in families, when you have brothers, all of them are tall, they're native people, they're foreign. English people are not used to seeing them. They all look alike. So I'm sure that the English was visited by various curious natives who wasn't Powhatan Tsenacommacah, but reported back to him. I'm pretty sure that was what was going down. But what happened was Matoaka actually did get too close for comfort and got herself caught. But you notice if you ever check behind me and read the story about how she got caught, she got caught by betrayal. People that she trusted from her own people, from her own Tsenacommacah people, led her to them. She didn't come to him because she was curious and she wanted to be a part of the English. She was led to the English by deceptive relatives that wanted to be in her place. That's very important to understand. Oh, somebody's in the room. Let's see who it is. Hey, Galion, what's up? How you doing? Pocahontas' other name was Matoaka and Amunut. Notice the key name Amunut. A lot of these names sounds a lot like Kemet names. Now, the Tsenacommacah had about 3,100 different regions. These are families that basically own certain regions of Virginia. And Powhatan in reference what was usually referred to as a leader. It wasn't the name of a nation, but it also was a region. And it usually made basically, if you were referred to as Powhat, you was a divine one. That's basically what they were saying when they said that. And it was generally pronounced outright when it came down to that. Powhite when it came to the place. Sounds similar. I can see how the English would get that mixed all up. Again, the land was very densely inhabited when the English got here. That's why it was very important to make friends with Powhatan Tsenacommacah, and that's why the capture of Matoaka was very important, because basically when they captured her, that was his favorite daughter. He just did not want to see her die. And as long as they kept her at ransom, basically for their lives, you know, don't attack. That was the ransom. There was no money. Native Americans didn't use money. The whole money was time. They were buying time with the ransom. They were buying time for them to get reinforcements there, so they can deal with the Tsenacommacah militarily with a bigger force than what they had originally. And again, there was a high rate of deaths also going on with the diseases that was carried by the Europeans. The measles was never seen, and smallpox was another disease that's described amongst the Native Americans as happening to them. They didn't know what was happening. They said, why in the world are these plagues happening? They were getting measles and smallpox for the first time. And these were plagues that had wiped out a good, already like centuries ago, wiped out a good portion of Europe. And now it was wiping out a good portion of the Tsenacommacah. And it's reported that more than half of the natives died from disease. More than half. I'm going to say about 60%. That's based on reports. Now, they didn't do a percentage, but just based on what they said that they thought was there before, and then what was reported to be there later. And basically, most of that was not war. Most of that was based on disease and just dying from these diseases that they never encountered. And like I said before, Africans were here from the very beginning. A whole shipload of Africans came here. 1619. Let's put that in reference. There was only 100 British, white British or European British here. And so there was just as many Africans. There might have been 200-300 Africans here. And almost 60% of those English had died off before the reinforcements came. So you had about 30 or 40 Englishmen left when the Africans showed up. And of course, when the Africans showed up, some additional British showed up with them, bringing their ranks back up to about 100 or so, or 200 or so. And this was in 1619. And perhaps some people had been born, so they might have had pulled their ranks up a little bit. But many survivors, after all of the disease happened, they just said maybe the area is messed up. A lot of the Tsenacommacah said, well, maybe Miche Manuto, maybe we've done something wrong. Maybe we need to leave. I mean, since these people showed up, all these bad things have been happening. That's not a good sign. So a lot of them left and joined other tribes that they were affiliated. Again, more north and more closer to the Great Lakes and toward the plains. Again, the river called the James River also was called the Powhatan. At least that's what it was called by the colonials. But it was something similar called by the natives. And the female was called the Wezawarrens-Kawala. Wezawarrens-Pawala. The male was the Wezawarrens, the king. The queen was the Wezawarrens-Palawa. The northern shore of the York River is basically where the main hub of the Tsenacommacah was located. The original tribes was the Powhats, the Hapamatuk, the Pamunkey, the Mattapanai, the Chisisiak, and the Kikuotan. Those were the original tribes of the Tsenacommacah until they start adding others. This is before the this is before the English arrived when this happened. All these tribes had the same language group. The Comac was located on the eastern shore across the Chesapeake Bay, going towards a place we call New Jersey, just to let you know the reach. At least the Chesapeake portion of the New Jersey. And there was 500,000 living there in that region around the year 1600. Now, this information is also backed up by archaeology. I'm not just saying this out of my head. I mean, I'm saying it out of my head, but it's also backed up by archaeology. And the number one thing that really plagued the Native Americans was really the contact with the Europeans. It was definitely, there was curiosity. They wanted to learning and seeing new things. At the same time, they were getting killed off by disease. Underneath Powhatan Confederacy, he had at least 8,000 warriors. At least underneath him. At his command. Just to let you know how powerful this man was as a military leader. So they could have, they were definitely giving the earlier colonials a run for their money. And this was even during the time, that's how you know the population was deep. So during the time, they were still suffering from the diseases. The English actually started conflict immediately upon their arrival. They fired shots on the natives as soon as they arrived. The very next day, all this stuff that you see of getting off boats and it's peaceful, that's bullcrap. They got off the boats firing. Because they had just got finished dealing before they arrived in Jamestown with the Spanish. And they were fighting with them. It was not a peaceful group of people. These were mercenaries who were good enough to fight the Spanish just before they landed in King William. So we get this idea of women and children and all these kind of people. Nah. These were conquistador types. These were people who were set up just to go in and fight and kill and take over. That's what they were designed to do. That's how they could give the Spanish such a good fight before they even got there. As soon as they got in, they were cocky, you know. Okay, let's take some of these natives out. Set up a foundation, but they found out, ooh, there's a lot of natives. And also there's a record that Captain John Smith, he has himself, that he tied a native person on a hunting expedition to himself. He tied him to him so that the arrows of the Native Americans would not hit him because they were trying to avoid their brother Tsenacommacah. So Captain John Smith had a record of having a hostage and keeping that hostage would basically keep him alive because the natives didn't want to fire on their own people. They didn't want to fire their arrows on their own people. And that's why I'm doing the painting this way, because this is by his own records. That this is one of his procedures. This is something that he did as a defense mechanism in his career as an explorer of primitive cultures, or cultures that they were trying to conquer. Of course, all Smith did was a lie, because a lot of the recounts of Pocahontas that John Smith wrote, he put in his journal in 1640, after Pocahontas had became romanticized and popular. She basically became like Joan of Arc, you know. She basically kind of taken on like a rock star kind of status, and then of course he said, "Oh yeah, let me start making some positive things about her rescuing me and stuff like that." And the reality is, none of that was in his original journals that he published in the 1614 to 1617. Nothing. So I'm more inclined to believe his original journals in his latter journals, where basically he was using people. One of his practices was using natives as human shields, because he discovered that the natives didn't want to fire their arrows on other natives. And so what they would do is they would hold their arrows until they can get a clean shot. And so that's what's going to be depicted in this particular battle scene right here. It's depicted right here in this, because this was basically, they were cowards. They were not they were not these glorious soldiers. It's all romanticized that how wonderful and how how noble these people were. No, there was nothing noble about them. They basically would take a woman or any person that could be a human shield. And of course, if the person was important, they would just find somebody with beads on them. Oh, this person's got beads, they're important. This person's of the higher class. Surely they're not going to fire on me now. And guess what? It worked. They didn't. And also they wanted to, and another reason we know that this would never happen, because when they actually have a record where they tried to, hello, how's it going, Frank? What's going on, man? When they tried to get King Powhatan to actually be, they wanted to be underneath King James as a king, so they wanted to coronate him, because again, he had a lot of people under his control. So it was very important for them to have a friendly relationship with him. They did try to kind of con him into having a friendly relationship, even after they came in and shot up some of his people, jacked up some people. They still tried to get him to do that. And so they actually got a crown made up. The English had a crown made up. And you know, when a king becomes a king, he has to bow down to whatever clergy person. And Tsenacommacah wouldn't bow. This is by the English's own records. He wouldn't bow because that's how much pride these guys had. Basically, if his head was lower, he was a tall man. First of all, he was almost 7 foot tall. So if his head was lower than somebody who was subject to him, that is not something that the Reservoirs did. That won't gonna happen. Your head was not gonna be lower so they can put a crown on you. So what they wound up doing was they had to lean on his shoulder and get some other Englishmen to heist him up to put the crown on his head. Because that was a symbol in front of his people too, that he was bowing. And again, the whole symbol of bowing is a European concept. And but the natives knew what that meant. They knew what bowing meant. They knew when you bow to somebody what that meant. And there was no way in the world that this man, Tsenacommacah, was going to bow. And guess what? He did not bow. He did not bow. So, and that's down for record, that didn't happen. And the only way they got that crown on his head was they had to hoist it up there to him. And if anybody was to raise his head above Tsenacommacah's head, they would be killed. Simple as that. So these natives, when they showed up, they was respected. They were dominant people. They were respected. They were very strong warrior type men. They were not some little shrivelly little fellow. Like some of the people who claimed descendants of them. These were large physical specimens of men, because that's how you got selected. As a king, you got selected because you was the biggest, strongest, smartest guy. And you have generation after generation after generation of the women selecting you. You know, the parents selecting you, but basically it's the council of women selecting you. Is he strong enough to produce my next queen? And then we're going to select the next strong one. It's basically how it worked. That's how it worked. And that's why all of the toughest, strongest guys, you weren't going to get anybody weak showing up. The weak guys just stayed at home. They just knew, okay, I'm not in this show. I'm not tough enough. There's some tough dudes going down there pursuing Matoaka. Some tough fellas showing up. And I might have to fight one of them to prove that I should be the one. You know, it's something. I got to do some exploits to prove that I have what it takes to be the king. So if you did get to be a king, you was a pretty tough guy. Because the kings were selected, the queens were born. That's very important to understand. Hey, how's it going? How's it going? What's going on? Kaba, what's up, man? How you doing? So, just to know something about original to Tsenacommacah native, Eastern native culture. That is very important to know. The women selected the king. The king was elected by the women. And the women were the bloodline that had to select the king. A guy could just get up there and just kill some people and say, okay, I done killed my rivals, therefore I get to be the king. That's just not how it worked. And they'll group up on you and kill you off because you were a person that didn't follow. You were lawless, basically. But eventually Opechecano was shot. They didn't even shoot him in the front. They invited these guys there, and when he turned his back to the gentleman who killed him, that's when he shot him. And the guy was already 92 years old. He was an old dude. And he was still tough, and they were still scared of him. And he was captured. And as a captive with no arms at all, the guard, they said the guard that was keeping him, but I don't believe that. Because when they killed him, some of the native people, I mean, they're not going to let the king just sit there just being at hostage. They were like, they're ready to say, okay, let's see how we can get this guy out of here. And I'm sure they said, these guys are going to come. They're going to come because he's here. They says, the only way they're going to give us a break if he's dead, and then they're going to select another leader. So what they did was they just killed him. That's what happened. Because even though he was shot, originally, he survived it. He survived it. He recouped, even at that age. So you're talking about some people that was very robust, some people that was very tough. You know, you had the best physical specimen that you could find out of the tribe. You know, it was not something that you just get. You know, you just walk up to and say, okay, I'm the bloodline, therefore I need to be the king. No, the women were the bloodline, and you had to earn it. You had to earn that. That's how that worked. But what happened was the College of William and Mary started helping the whatever was left of the Tsenacommacah to get education. So there was some kind of apology kind of thing going on between some of the people and what was left. But at this point, most of the natives were Christianized. They were kind of settled. They were no more longer warlike at all. And they were already conquered, well conquered. There was no more people like Opechecano trying to keep his claim on what he considered to be his land, his people's land. There was and then they also passed a law. The English passed a law that we get to select your reservoirs from now on. So a lot of the people who became reservoirs after, I think it was 1649, when that law was passed, they weren't even selected by the Council of Women no more. They were selected, they had to be selected by the governor. The governor had to approve. They might have let the women pick somebody, but it had to be somebody approved of. And of course, the persons that they approved of was somebody who was, very favorable towards the English. Again, because they got the whole state of Virginia out of the deal with the other reservoirs, who was basically an idiot. And again, he wasn't the toughest brother of Powhatan Confederacy. He wasn't. He was probably the dumbest brother. But unfortunately, he got to be the one who became the reservoirs for the British. And you can tell he was the dumbest because he just gave everything away to the enemy. He didn't even argue with them. He didn't even give them an argument. Like I say, I believe because he was Christianized. I believe he thought that he had friends. I believe he thought that the English was going to do all this good stuff for them to kind of, because they were taking some of them to England and showing them, oh, look what we have over here in Europe. You can have this here too. And we could do all this stuff in your name, in the name of the natives, which was that won't going to happen. It was basically in them marrying in maybe and staking a claim for the English, but for them maybe to marry somebody, but for the most part, there was going to be another English person marrying another English person after marrying. So the people are not that much, they're not much native blood in them. They're basically still English. Because it was not like, in order to have a culture, you really have to have your own language. Once your language is gone and once your religion is gone, your culture is dead. So, like I say, everybody knew, the English knew that. Just, okay, let's convert them. And they can look a certain way. They can still look brown. They can still look a little different. But for the most part, we're in charge. This is our culture. A lot of times the hairstyles of the men were done by the women as well. The women were the barbers. And the Powhatan women basically maintained a lot of autonomy. They maintained a lot of control over the society. And like I say, the women were basically the farmers, and the men were primarily the hunters. That's how the duties were kind of separated. So the women stayed with the crops. And I'm pretty sure that's how John Rolfe probably got a little bit more knowledge about tobacco and how to raise it. From his folly with the native women. His dealings with them. Because they were the ones that you could capture because they were connected to a little village, and you just came in with your guns, firing it, making a lot of noise. The natives would run, and you would basically look over and peruse what they had going. The men were out hunting, and you can go in there and kind of figure out exactly how they're making a living, how these people are actually making it happen for themselves. So that kind of was like a procedure of conquest, sort of. And that's not the romanticized procedure, that's the actual procedure. Now, the sun, Ra, was very important to Tsenacommacahs. That's another thing that and and the sun was in control of the harvest. That was part of their religious practice. So it's just really, really interesting when you start actually looking at some comparison to even some of the ancient Egyptian stuff. Wow. And then you go to the Mayans and you go to, there's a lot of consistency.